Thanks for coming to S4, Michael. Appreciate it.
Thank you, and Emily Goldman and Richard Hartnett also thank you.
Now, Michael wrote, and his co-authors wrote, what I found to be a very important book called Cyber Persistence Theory. And the way I want to structure this interview is we're going to talk about the theory itself for 20 minutes, and then talk about how, if states implement this theory like they seem to be doing, how this will affect the asset owners and critical infrastructure owner-operators in this room. So maybe a good place to start is that you treat cyber as a third strategic realm. There's nuclear, conventional, and now cyber. And one of the things you write is that the cyber strategic environment is one of exploitation, not coercion. Can you explain this difference to me?
Yeah, thank you. You started off with one of our major points, so I'm grateful for that. Coercion, if I were to describe it, comprises threats, demands, commitment, signaling, and interaction. I think everybody probably who has children has some sense of what coercion may be on a minor scale. Folks who have studied state behavior in and through cyberspace and built data sets of the same have found virtually no evidence of this occurring over the past 2 decades between states. No coercive behavior in and through cyberspace. Cybersecurity scholars in the security studies and IR theory discipline have made very strong arguments that cyber operations themselves are very weak coercive instruments, right? We argue that the dominant behavior in cyberspace is exploitation. And exploitation primarily takes the form of what we call the cyber fait accompli. I would suggest that all of you have been subject to one, even though you may not know that you have. Cyber fait accompli is a limited gain at a target's expense where the target is either unaware, unable, or unwilling to respond. This is important because states are accumulating strategic gains in and through cyberspace via exploitative campaigns, not via coercive cyber operations. If you don't have a strategy that aligns with the strategic threat, your strategy is going to fail.
Well, and you kind of touched on where I wanted to go next. If these exploitations take place and they're fait accompli, so basically they happen without reaction. And page 25 you wrote, in the cyber strategic environment, states can advance strategic level cumulative effects without direct exchange, without coercive shaping or behavior, and without war. So you're saying essentially that they can have a strategic result without ever entering war or anything like that. Can you maybe give me an example, one example of where it's happened and one example where it could happen in the future?
I'll give you 2.
Okay, perfect.
Of where it's happened, and a third way to think about where it might happen. North Korea is often cited as an example. In the last 4 years, North Korea has used cyber-enabled operations, or cyber-enabled operations to undermine the SWIFT international currency exchange system, to exploit international banks, to exploit cryptocurrency exchanges, to exploit the bridges to those exchanges, to the tune of about $2 billion. Over the last 4 years. If you compare that historically to what they've done through counterfeiting, it took them 25 years of counterfeiting to accumulate that same amount of wealth. So in 4 years, they matched it through cyberspace. And what do they do with those funds? They direct it toward resourcing their ballistic missile and nuclear programs. And we now have estimates from Northern Command, the folks who are shooting out of the sky all those UFOs that are flying around the United States recently, that our ground-based missile defense system, which primarily was established and set up in Alaska for rogue states like North Korea and Iran, is now going to be obsolete against this threat. Right? So North Korea has changed the balance of power because of their activities in and through cyberspace. China has also maintained the balance of power, which is why I wanted to give you 2 examples. Right? Some can use cyber to increase their power, some use it to maintain their power, some use it to take power away from others. China in 2010 was concerned about falling into the middle income trap. Right? They were an industrial economy. They were about to slide over into the edge of stagnation, They didn't want to lose their great power status, and so they instantiated a massive campaign of intellectual property theft. The United States was the primary target. They re-innovated a lot of that, used that to plus up their GDP, and maintained a growth of 6% so that they didn't fall into the middle income trap. So two really good examples of strategic outcomes through cyber operations alone, independent. The way to think about how states might do it in the future is to look at their goals. Right? States are pretty clear and public, frankly, a lot of open source material on what their strategies are. So we want to look at what their goals and objectives are, and then we have to look back at what are our sources of national power, and what are our instruments of national power, and how could they use cyber to target those to achieve their strategic objectives. I'm not going to pretend to be nearly as clever as cyber operators in the dens of our adversaries, but we've seen over time that, any given month they'll come up with a new clever way to exploit our sources of national power or instruments of national power to reap strategic gains for their own ends.
Okay, so we have exploitation happening over and over and again, and eventually accumulating to a strategic level change. One of the concepts that I had really difficulty with in the book was you're telling us this theory doesn't really look at it in terms of offense or defense, but the key term you use is initiative. And you say initiative rather than restraint is necessitated. So maybe explain how defense can be initiative or offense can be initiative, or find some way maybe to help me with this problem I'm having.
Yeah, one of the things that we emphasize is that when you have a new theory, you have to have a new lexicon, new terms that go with it. Because if you just adopt terms from other theories, your new theory is going to get lost, right? So the terms offense and defense in cyberspace, in our view, are vastly overused because most of the activity in cyberspace occurs in a geopolitical condition of competition, right? Not crisis and not armed conflict. And offense and defense doesn't really apply well in competition. So what we say is that what matters in cyberspace is you have to have initiative. And if I was to define it as a noun, initiative is a posture of anticipation, right? And so what you have to do is seize the initiative in cyberspace. You have to have that posture of anticipation. You have to take it away from the adversary, because if you have the posture of anticipation, they're on the back foot and they're responding to what you're doing. If they have it, you're on the back foot. So do you want to be reacting, or do you want to be acting in cyberspace? If you seize the initiative, you're acting, you're setting the tempo, you're driving the actions of the adversary, and that works to your advantage.
Well, let's go back then to the example you gave, the China IP theft example. So they would have the initiative as they're coming in, trying to steal the IP. I understand how we would defend. I could understand how we would react, and we've actually seen some of that with sanctions and such. But how would we regain the initiative in a case like that?
It's a good question. So I would say arguably we haven't at this point. We tried to do so diplomatically with President Obama's agreement with President Xi in 2015. And if you've studied that case closely, they say that there was a drop-off in IP theft, but then it bumped up again very quickly just a few months after. So that wasn't really successful. How could we do it in and through cyberspace?
In this cyber strategic environment.
Yeah, so what we could do is we know where those data go in China. We know what servers they land on, and we could corrupt those servers. Right? I'm not recommending that we do that. I'm not saying we have, but that is taking the initiative back from China so that what they took from us, they no longer can make use of.
We should add it as a CTF target. Is one of these things.
Well, again, we have to be careful. I don't want to suggest. I don't make policy. I write theory.
But see, this is where I had trouble with the terminology, because I can understand they're doing something. They're trying to steal IP. Whether it be China or any country, they're trying to steal IP. We can defend to make it harder for them to steal. What you're talking about, I would consider that to be like a counteroffensive. You know,
Yeah.
I don't understand the difference between like initiative and a counteroffensive. I can understand sometimes you're just trying to protect, sometimes you're trying to degrade their ability, I think, or their benefit of it. But I still, I'll get off it in a second. But I want to try one more time.
Yeah, no, that's okay. So it's not, in my view, counteroffensive, right?
Okay.
It's seizing the initiative. It's actually a defensive action, right? So in joint publication 3-12, which is the DoD pub that has a taxonomy, they talk about defensive operations off the DoD, off the DoD information network. So that's when you are defending outside CONUS, basically outside the United States. So that's what that is for me. But that's just one example of being initiative persistent. Right? Another example is adopting, from the defensive side, zero trust architecture. Because zero trust, theoretically, is supposed to be constantly verifying and constantly authenticating. Right? That constantness, to make up a word, is persistence. Mm-hmm. Right? It's initiative persistence. So that also serves to deny adversaries from taking advantage of your vulnerabilities.
Okay. Well, I promised I'd get off that. I would just note that I wonder if United States or some entity going back and attacking someone else's server to destroy data they stole, if they would view that as defense. You know, if you go into their system and their servers, they might not consider that defense. But again, maybe that term doesn't exist. Maybe it's just initiative.
Well, I would say they might not consider it attacking.
Attacking, okay.
Right. They might consider it grappling, is the term we use in the book. Right.
Okay. So this kind of ties in, though. I wrote that I find this a little bit terrifying. So again, you wrote initiative rather than restraint is necessitated, and states face a structural imperative to persist in seizing and maintaining the initiative to set the conditions of security in and through cyberspace by exploiting adversary vulnerabilities and reducing the potential for exploitation of their own. To me, this reminds me almost a little bit like the cult of the offensive prior to World War I, where people said the only way we're going to win is we got to be more active. We got to be out there taking the initiative, getting into their systems, making sure they're not doing bad things. Make me feel better. Why should I not be terrified that this means every state's going to be trying to get into not only government systems, but critical infrastructure systems?
I would suggest that most states are always trying to do that. Right? That's the nature of the competitive space. But it's not like offense advantage in World War I, and it's really not terrifying. So I'll share an anecdote. Okay. I promise to share an anecdote. When we presented this logic initially, when Richard Hartnett and I presented it to some colleagues, they had the exact same reaction. Right? They said this is. Well, here's what they said. They said the logic is absolutely compelling and infallible. I just don't like what it suggests. Right? Which is I think where you are.
Kind of where I am.
And my reaction to that was, I don't like the fact that nuclear weapons have been pointing at me for my entire lifetime, right? And they point at other states, and yet the security logic of assured second strike flows from the characteristics of nuclear technologies. This is the same thing for cyberspace. The security logic of initiative persistence flows from the structural characteristics of cyberspace. For nuclear weapons, it led to strategic stability. We're suggesting that the same thing will happen in cyberspace. Mm-hmm. The logic flows from the technology itself.
I think another key concept from the book that I picked up on was this cyber agreed competition, which to me sounded very similar to what a lot of us call cyber norms. that there is a certain line that you can go up to where it's not going to trigger this reaction. The kind of your fait accompli line. If you do this, you're not going to get punched back. They might do something else, but they're not going to respond directly. And the lower line, I guess, doesn't really matter because that could go down to zero. Where are we today in cyber agreed competition? Especially, let's say we've got utilities, pipelines. is it agreed upon competition that they can maintain a presence in our grid, or in a large pipeline, or a key manufacturer?
It's a good question. I'm glad you didn't ask me about norms, because we'd be up here for hours. Cyber agreed competition, we refer to it as a phenomenon. Just like in international relations, balance of power is a phenomenon. It's something that emerges from the activities of states, right? It's not something you try to achieve, it just emerges. Same thing with cyber agreed competition. States are competing in and through cyberspace, and we say that there is a tacit understanding of a ceiling of use of force and armed attack equivalents. That if you breach that ceiling, so if you go after critical infrastructure and you destroy it, you have breached the ceiling of agreed competition. That changes the dynamic from a geopolitical condition of competition to now at least militarized crisis and possibly armed conflict, right? So we do think states recognize that if you stay below that ceiling of agreed competition, which is armed attack equivalents or use of force, you can experiment a lot, right? And states are experimenting a lot. You see most of what happens is below that threshold. Now the substance, we want to be clear, when we say agreed competition, that doesn't mean we agree with the substance, right, normatively of what's going on in that space. But what we're suggesting is that states have agreed now that this is a competitive and it is an active space, and we are going to play in this space and try to gain strategic advantage in this space without having to cross into militarized crisis, without having to provoke an armed conflict.
I always think about this almost, going back to marketing days, where every company has a brand. Whether they like it or not, it's, the idea that pops into someone's head, and the brand might be different for certain groups of people and other groups of people. And I would believe that this line that you talked about, organizations have an idea of what their line is, but they might not disagree. Two countries in competition, or non-state actors in competition, one might think the line's here, the other might think the line's there. And even in your book, you write that it's currently immature, chances for misjudgment abound.
Yeah. So what we currently say is that the substance in that bounded space is immature, but the ceiling, that threshold of use of force and armed attack equivalent, is pretty well understood.
Really?
Right? Not explicitly, but states are bound by, if they want to be, not all states act this way, but they're bound by international law.
Okay.
And Article 2.4 and Article 51 of the UN Charter say that you cannot threaten or use of force, and that if you engage in an armed attack equivalent, a state can respond with armed attack equivalents as well. States know this, right? So if they're able to achieve strategic gains in this competitive space without crossing that threshold, why wouldn't they? Right? Why would they risk crossing it and then bring into play all the consequences and additional risks that come with armed conflict and crises?
Well, I could see that taking place in two different ways depending on who's in charge. I could see saying, I think the line's here, so I'm going to give myself a 10% buffer zone and not come close to that line. Or I could see someone else saying, the line's here, can we move it up 10%? Can we just go over the line a little bit and see what happens?
Yeah, so what you're describing is a risk-acceptant actor, right? That applies equally well to kinetic capability, too, all right? I mean, President Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. We haven't heard that for decades. Right? He's clearly a risk-acceptant actor. When you're dealing with a risk-acceptant actor, whether it's in the cyber strategic environment, in the conventional, or in the nuclear, there's not much you can do, right? They're going to do what they want to do, because they're willing to accept the risks and consequences.
Okay. Well, I want to shift now, because in his book, if you get a copy of his book, and again, he'll be signing them at the Cabana sessions, the foreword is written by General Nakasone. And he talks about how Michael and his co-authors played a big role in this. So, he doesn't go as far as saying, we believe everything in the book. He's very clear about that. But I don't think he would have written the foreword if this wasn't influencing, to some degree, the U.S. thinking. So whether it's right or wrong, the amount of, mind share and following that this has in the world would be really important to anyone that might be targeted. What would you say right now, how widely is this theory in play? Is it primarily a U.S. action, or do others think they're playing the same game as well?
So the notion of initiative persistence was understood by Russia and China long before the United States government understood it, right? They started playing the game in cyberspace in 2008, 2009, 2010. But in 2018, when Cybercom wrote its strategic vision and then DoD came out with its cyber strategy of Defend Forward, and then Cybercom operationalized that as the strategic approach of persistent engagement, that was the big marker on the wall in the U.S., right? Mm-hmm. That is the DoD's manifestation of the concept of initiative persistence. Since then, and as General Nakasone says in his foreword, he was curious to see how the rest of the U.S. government, adopted this. Mm-hmm. And we've seen adoption, right? I think most aggressively we've seen it by the FBI and the DOJ. So the FBI now is being much more proactive. They changed their strategy a year ago to a much more proactive posture where they are taking down the infrastructure of criminal gangs. They just took down Hive in coordination with some of our allies. Cybercom also took down TrickBot before the elections. You see CISA, of course, is doing a lot, much more proactive. Their first new strategy in a couple of years came out. It's very proactively oriented, so this is the idea of initiative persistence. CESR, what CESR does in terms of working with the national laboratories to look at asset owners' equipment to see if there are vulnerabilities, that's initiative persistence. Okay, so the concept manifests differently based on what the responsibilities, capacities, and functions are of organizations. So we're starting to see a wider spread in the United States. We're also starting to see a wider spread globally. If you look at the cyber strategies of the UK, of Germany, of Spain, of France, of Italy, of Australia, of Canada, the Czech Republic, you'll see a much more proactive posture. Now, they're saying we have to be on, not the offensive, right? But we have to be on the front foot to stay ahead of our adversaries in this space. You'll see it in how they are now trying to interpret international law, right? They're rethinking how do we think of sovereignty in this initiative persistent strategic environment of cyberspace. It can't be that everything stops at the border. The interconnectedness of cyberspace disallows that, right? So if that's not the case, how do we have to rethink about sovereignty? How do we have to rethink about the rule of non-intervention, right? The Department of State is taking a good lead in that. And you see the UK talking about that as well. So, when you introduce a new theory that really challenges the existing security theory, and the existing security theory in the globe, not just in the United States, for the last 70 years has been deterrence. We are challenging deterrence. We are saying, in this cyber strategic environment, where most of the strategic activity occurs short of use of force and armed attack equivalents, deterrence doesn't work. Here's a new theory. That troubles people, right? Mentally, it is difficult when you've learned something for 3 generations to suggest now there's something new for this new space. It's called paradigm shift. Those of you who know Thomas Kuhn and the structure of scientific revolutions, he talks about this. It happens slowly, painfully, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing slow, gradual change, but eventually the new paradigm supplants the one that's no longer sufficient, and we get exponential growth. That's what we're hoping for.
So you're saying that before the U.S. did it, China and a few others were doing it, the ones that you mentioned, you gave some examples of. You mentioned a lot of the, I'd say, countries that are friendly to the United States. Should we expect to see like Pakistan and India be doing this, and India and China, and the kind of the other places where they've had not necessarily recent wars, but long-standing competition? So
yeah.
You expect this to be as like conventional strategic environment? Eventually, this environment will permeate the whole world.
Without question. As states' capacities increase, and thank you for using the word competition. So we see a lot of it recently between India and China.
Yeah.
Right? China's going after Indian infrastructure because they're having a kinetic skirmish at the border. Right? So China is saying, look, I mean, we can do it this way, where the risk of escalation are much greater, or we can actually do this in cyberspace, so we can convey to one another through tacit engagement that we're dissatisfied with what you're doing over there, so, slow it down.
So I guess then the big question is, I'm running a critical infrastructure system, a power plant, a water treatment plant, even mining and some manufacturing, and there's so many different critical infrastructure. In this cyber persistent world, what should I be doing?
So much. But if I were to offer one recommendation, and I have to precede it with a comment. Those of you who are asset owners, whether or not they're critical infrastructure, drive the economy of this country. You are very important. Those of you who run critical infrastructure, you are very important from a national security perspective, right? So what you have to ensure is that if the United States gets into a militarized crisis, our credibility is on the line. Credibility is supported by the functioning of our critical infrastructure. If the United States gets involved in an armed conflict, we need our critical infrastructure to be functioning to support that effort. So critical really means critical for you folks. So the one thing I would recommend and ask that you all do is to focus on developing a strategy of anticipatory resilience. This is a term that we introduce in the book, but we talk about it a lot in other places. And the expectation, it's not unlike the expectations behind the recommendation for zero trust. Expect that you're going to be exploited. Expect it, right? Plan for it, and then plan to be able to recover from it. You need those plans in place. Right? Don't just write them, implement them, and then share them with your sector-specific companies. That would be my one recommendation.
Yeah, I want to sneak in one last question. In your book, you write, states may tacitly and or explicitly or may seek to communicate that compromising the confidentiality but not the integrity or availability of certain critical infrastructure systems is acceptable behavior. A lot of times, if you have that capability for most of the systems in this room, it's a choice not to take it out or damage equipment or that. If you have the ability, if you're in the system sitting there with persistent communication to and from the system, you have the ability anytime you want to flip that switch. And like they did in Ukraine years ago. Yeah. They were in there for a while. They said, okay, today's the day we're shutting down those substations. To me, that would seem to be above the line. Even if they don't take the action, but just that they have the capability of taking the action. Mm-hmm. But the book seemed to indicate that it's more what you do with it than the capability that determines this maximum level for a fait accompli.
Yeah. So I'll respond with 2 points. One is, it's not as easy to hold something at risk as people think it is. Right. So Russia was in Ukraine's critical infrastructure in 2016. They tried to do it again last February and failed in a lot of areas. Mm-hmm. Right. So because the defense, it's offense defense fluidity. Right. The defense can come back and deny you access. But let's say that they're in. Right. China supposedly got into our natural gas in 2012. And was in a position to do damage. I'll go back to an earlier point. What's the incentive for them to do it? Right? If they're already achieving strategic gains without causing destruction, and when you cause destruction, you invite additional risks and consequences associated with crisis and armed conflict. If they don't have to do that to achieve their strategic gains, why would they do it? Right? So it's incentive. It comes down to incentive.
I'm still a little terrified.
I know.
But then again, as you said, I'm terrified by nuclear war as well. So
Yeah,
it might be a reality
yeah,
system.
So one more comment on that. Look, in addition to just looking at state behavior, folks have looked at the interaction between states in cyberspace for over the last decade.
Okay.
Zero incidents of escalation. None. Right? None. And think, there are thousands, if not millions, of interactions between states in and through cyberspace. And over that period, we've seen no state escalate out of that agreed competition space and into militarized crisis or armed conflict. So the notion that these behaviors will lead to escalation is not supported empirically. It's just not.
I'm going to have to find you at the welcome party, but I want to let people go to the morning break. I appreciate everyone staying through the whole keynote block. We're going to go to morning break, but before we do, remember that Michael will be signing copies of his book at the Cabana sessions, and you'll be around today and tomorrow at least.
Yes,
so I'm sure he'd be anxious to learn more about what we do. And thank you, Michael, for coming and signing some books.
Yeah, thank you, Dale. Thank you, everybody.